The folder landed on Mrs. Patterson's desk with a heavy thud. She looked up to see the principal standing there with that expression she'd come to recognize over her 23 years of teaching. The look that said, "We've got another difficult one." "This is Daniel Romano," Principal Henderson said, sliding the folder toward her. "He'll be in your homeroom starting Monday. I wanted to give you a heads up." Mrs. Patterson opened the file. The pages seemed endless. Incident reports, suspension notices, counselor notes. She flipped through slowly, reading phrases that jumped out at her. Refuses to cooperate. Disruptive behavior. Physical altercation with another student. Verbally aggressive toward staff. 2 previous schools, both ending in expulsion. The boy was only 12 years old. "I know what you're thinking," Henderson continued, "but the district assigned him here and we have to give it a shot. I'm putting him with you because, well, if anyone can handle him, it's you." Mrs. Patterson closed the folder. She'd heard this before. Too many times, actually. The problem kids always ended up in her classroom because she'd been teaching long enough that people assumed she had some magic formula. The truth was she didn't. She just showed up every day and tried her best. That following Monday morning, the classroom buzzed with the usual first day of school energy. Kids chatted about their summers, compared schedules, sized up their new teacher. Mrs. Patterson stood at the front, greeting students as they filed in, learning names, making mental notes. Then he walked in. Daniel moved like he was trying to take up as little space as possible. His dark hoodie was pulled up despite the warm September weather. A worn backpack hung from one shoulder. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor as he navigated between desks, heading straight for the back corner. The other students barely noticed him, too caught up in their own conversations. But Mrs. Patterson noticed everything. She noticed how his shoulders hunched forward, how his hands gripped the straps of his backpack so tightly his knuckles turned white. She noticed that when he finally sat down, he pulled that hoodie even lower over his face. During lunch that day, Mrs. Patterson sat in the teacher's lounge with her sandwich. The conversation inevitably turned to students, as it always did. "So you got the Romano kid," Mrs. Chen from the math department said. "Good luck with that one." "I had his brother 2 years ago," Mr. Williams added. "That whole family is trouble. The kid's been bounced around foster homes since he was little. Mother's got issues. Father's not in the picture. It's a mess." "Don't waste your energy," Mrs. Chen continued. "Some kids just don't want to be helped. I've seen his type before. He'll be gone by Christmas, mark my words." Mrs. Patterson didn't say much. She just listened and thought about that boy sitting in the back corner of her classroom, trying to disappear. The first week was rough. Daniel didn't cause problems exactly, but he didn't participate either. He'd sit there, hood up, staring at his desk while Mrs. Patterson taught. When she passed out worksheets, he'd leave them blank. When she asked questions, he wouldn't even look up. It was like he'd built a wall around himself and she couldn't find a way through. Other students started asking questions. "Why doesn't Daniel ever talk? How come he doesn't have to do the work?" Mrs. Patterson gave simple answers. Everyone works at their own pace. Everyone's fighting their own battles. Be kind. On Friday of that first week, something small happened. Mrs. Patterson was returning graded homework when she accidentally knocked Daniel's pencil off his desk. It rolled across the floor. Without thinking, she bent down to pick it up. That's when she saw his shoes. They were falling apart, held together with duct tape. The laces were mismatched, and they were at least 2 sizes too small, based on how his feet seemed squeezed into them. She handed him the pencil. "Here you go, Daniel." For just a second, barely a moment, his eyes met hers. And in that brief glance, she didn't see aggression or defiance. She saw something else entirely. Fear. Exhaustion. A kind of weariness that no 12-year-old should carry. "Thanks," he mumbled, so quietly she almost missed it. That weekend, Mrs. Patterson couldn't stop thinking about those shoes, about that look in his eyes, about all those incident reports in his file. She thought about what Mr. Williams had said about foster homes and family troubles. She thought about how quick everyone was to write this kid off. Sunday evening, she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, staring at Daniel's empty enrollment forms. Under emergency contact, there was just a caseworker's number. Under parent guardian, the current foster family's names were written in someone else's handwriting. Under interests and hobbies, the line was blank. She thought about all the students she'd taught over the years, Thousands of kids had sat in her classroom. Most of them she remembered fondly. Some had gone on to do amazing things. Others had struggled. But they'd all taught her something important. Every child has a story, and most of the time, behavior is just a symptom of something deeper. Monday morning came. Daniel walked in the same way he had before, hoodie up, eyes down, heading straight for that back corner. But this time, Mrs. Patterson decided something. She decided that whatever was in that file, whatever other teachers said, whatever his reputation was, she was going to see him differently, not as a problem to be managed, but as a kid who needed someone to actually look at him. She didn't know it yet, but that decision would change everything. Not just for Daniel, but for her too. Because sometimes the students we teach end up teaching us the most important lessons of all. The morning announcements crackled through the speaker. Students settled into their seats. Another school week began. And in the back corner, Daniel Romano pulled out a notebook and stared at the blank page in front of him, completely unaware that his life was about to take a turn he never saw coming. 3 weeks into the school year, Mrs. Patterson decided to do something she rarely did. A surprise notebook check. She'd been teaching long enough to know that sometimes you learned more about students from what they wrote, when they thought no one was looking, than from any formal assignment. "All right, everyone, I need you to pass your English notebooks to the front," she announced after the morning bell. "Don't worry, this isn't for a grade. I just want to see how you're using them." The usual groans filled the classroom. Students shuffled through their bags, pulling out notebooks in various states of organization. Some were neat and color-coded. Others looked like they'd been through a war. One by one, the notebooks made their way to her desk in messy stacks. Daniel's notebook came last. He hesitated before sliding it forward, and Mrs. Patterson noticed his hand linger on it for just a moment, like he was second-guessing whether to hand it over. But then he let go and pulled his hoodie lower over his face, slumping back in his seat. The rest of the day moved at its usual pace. Classes came and went. Students asked questions, completed assignments, packed up their things. When the final bell rang and the classroom emptied, Mrs. Patterson settled into her chair with the stack of notebooks and a red pen. Most of them were exactly what she expected. Half-finished notes. Doodles in the margins. A few industrious students had actually used them properly. She made quick notes on sticky tabs, praising effort here, suggesting improvements there. The afternoon light slanted through the windows as she worked through the stack. Then she reached Daniel's notebook. The cover was worn and bent. Someone had scribbled over the label with black marker. She opened it, expecting to find blank pages or maybe a few hostile words. After all, Daniel hadn't turned in a single assignment since he'd arrived. The first few pages were indeed empty. So were the next several. She was about to close it and move on when she flipped to a page that made her stop completely. There, in the margins, were drawings. Not the careless doodles she'd seen in other notebooks. These were different. Real drawings. A cityscape stretched across the ruled lines, buildings rising at impossible angles, windows catching imaginary light. The detail was incredible. Every brick seemed individually placed. Every shadow fell exactly where it should. She turned the page. More drawings. A portrait of an elderly man, his face mapped with wrinkles, his eyes holding a lifetime of stories. The shading was sophisticated, done entirely in pencil, with a level of control she hadn't seen in years of teaching. Another page. A tree, its branches reaching across the paper like veins, each leaf distinct. A cat sitting on a windowsill, its fur so detailed she could almost feel its texture. A hand holding a broken chain, the links separating in midair. Mrs. Patterson forgot about the other notebooks. She forgot about the time. She sat there as the sun moved lower, turning pages, discovering image after image. Some were realistic. Others were surreal, dreamlike. But every single one showed an understanding of perspective, composition, and technique that took most people years to develop. This wasn't the work of a kid who'd taken some art classes. This was raw talent, natural ability, the kind of gift that couldn't be taught. She glanced at the assigned pages, the ones where students were supposed to take notes during her lessons. They were still blank, but the margins, those precious spaces around the edges, were filled with an entire world. That evening, Mrs. Patterson didn't go straight home. She sat at her kitchen table with Daniel's notebook open in front of her, a cup of tea growing cold beside it. She'd been teaching for over 2 decades. She'd seen talented students before, but this felt different. This felt important. She thought about the file on her desk at school. All those incident reports. All those labels. Disruptive. Aggressive. Unteachable. Not one single person had mentioned that this kid could create art that would make professional illustrators jealous. The next morning, Mrs. Patterson arrived at school early. She made copies of a few of Daniel's drawings, careful not to damage his notebook. Then she spent her planning period researching art programs, scholarships, summer camps. She printed information and tucked it into a folder. When Daniel shuffled into homeroom, hood up as always, she didn't say anything. She let the morning routine happen. Attendance, announcements, the usual start to the day. But when the other students pulled out their notebooks for the daily writing prompt, she walked to the back of the room. "Daniel," she said quietly, crouching beside his desk so they were at eye level. "Can I talk to you for a minute after class?" He tensed immediately. His shoulders went rigid. She could see him mentally preparing for whatever punishment he assumed was coming. "You're not in trouble," she added quickly. "I just want to ask you something." He gave the smallest nod. Barely visible under that hoodie, the class period felt endless. Mrs. Patterson taught her lesson on sentence structure, but her mind kept drifting to that notebook, to those drawings, to the conversation she was about to have. When the bell finally rang and students began filing out, Daniel stayed in his seat, that familiar look of resignation on his face. She waited until they were alone, then pulled a chair next to his desk and sat down. She placed his notebook between them, open to one of the cityscape drawings. "Daniel," she began, "where did you learn to draw like this?" He stared at the page. For a long moment he didn't respond. She wondered if he was going to ignore her like he ignored everything else. But then so quietly she almost missed it, he spoke. "Nowhere. I just do it. You just do it," she repeated. "Nobody taught you? No art classes, no lessons?" He shook his head, still not looking at her. Mrs. Patterson took a breath. She'd been teaching long enough to know this was a delicate moment. Push too hard and he'd shut down completely. But she had to try. "These are remarkable, Daniel. Really remarkable. I've been teaching for 23 years and I've never seen anything quite like this from a student your age." For the first time since he'd entered her classroom 3 weeks ago, Daniel looked up. Actually looked up. His eyes met hers and she saw surprise there. Confusion. Like he couldn't quite process what she was saying. "You're not mad?" he asked. "Mad? Why would I be mad?" "Because I didn't do the assignments. I just drew stuff instead." Mrs. Patterson smiled. "I'm not mad, Daniel. I'm amazed. Can I ask you something else? Why do you draw?" He looked back down at the notebook, his finger tracing the edge of one of the drawings. When he spoke again, his voice was even softer than before. "It's the only time things make sense. When I'm drawing, everything else just stops. All the noise in my head. It's quiet, and there it was. The truth that no incident report had captured. This kid wasn't a problem. He was surviving the only way he knew how. "What if I told you," Mrs. Patterson said carefully, "that I want to help you get better at this? That I think you have a real gift and it would be a shame to waste it?" Daniel's hand stopped moving. He looked at her again, and this time she saw something different in his eyes. Not fear, not exhaustion. Something that looked almost like hope. Fragile and uncertain, like he was afraid to believe what he was hearing. "What do you mean?" he asked. Mrs. Patterson opened the folder she'd prepared. Inside were brochures for art programs, information about local classes, details about competitions for young artists. She spread them across the desk. "I mean," she said, "that I think it's time people saw what you can really do." The bell for the next period rang. Students began filtering into the classroom for her next class. Daniel gathered up the papers, clutching them like they might disappear. He stood up, shouldering his backpack, but before he left, he turned back to her. "Mrs. Patterson?" His voice cracked slightly. "Thank you." 2 words. Simple words, but they carried the weight of 3 weeks of silence, of years of being overlooked, of finally being seen. As he walked out of the classroom, Mrs. Patterson noticed something different about his posture. His shoulders weren't quite so hunched. His grip on his backpack wasn't quite so tight. And for the first time since he'd arrived at her school, Daniel Romano looked like maybe, just maybe, things might be okay. The next morning, Mrs. Patterson arrived at school with a bag from the art supply store. She'd spent her evening browsing the aisles, picking out quality sketching pencils, a proper drawing pad, erasers, blending stumps. Nothing fancy, but professional enough to show she was serious. The total had made her wince a little, but some things were worth the investment. She tucked the bag into her desk drawer and waited for homeroom to begin. Daniel came in the same way he always did, though she thought maybe his steps were a little less heavy than before. When everyone settled and she began taking attendance, she could feel him watching her from the back corner. It was different than the blank stare he'd given her those first few weeks. Now there was curiosity there. After the morning announcements, she called him to her desk. "I've been thinking," she said, pulling out the bag of art supplies, "about what you said yesterday, about how drawing makes everything quiet. I want to make you an offer." Daniel's eyes widened slightly when he saw the supplies, but he didn't reach for them. He just stood there, hands shoved deep in his hoodie pockets. "Here's what I'm proposing," Mrs. Patterson continued. "Every day in this class we have about 45 minutes of work time. If you complete your assignments, even just the basic requirements, I'll give you the last 15 minutes to draw, and you can use these supplies." "They're yours." She watched his face carefully. Confusion flickered across it, followed by something that looked like suspicion. "I don't get it," he said finally. "Why would you do that?" "Because I think you have something special, Daniel. And I think it deserves time and space to grow. But I also think you're capable of doing the regular work too. This is me believing in both things at once." He stared at the art supplies like they might be a trap. "What if I can't do the assignments?" "Then we'll work on them together. But I think you can. I think you've been telling yourself you can't for so long that you started believing it." The bell rang. Students started filing in for first period. Daniel stood there for another moment, then took the bag from her desk. He didn't say anything, but the way he held it, careful and close, said enough. By lunchtime, word had spread through the teacher's lounge about Mrs. Patterson's arrangement. "You're rewarding him for not doing work all these weeks?" Mrs. Chen said, shaking her head. "That's backward. I'm not rewarding him," Mrs. Patterson replied, unwrapping her sandwich. "I'm giving him a reason to try." "It won't work," Mr. Williams added. "Kids like that, they take advantage. You give them an inch, they take a mile. He'll do the bare minimum and spend the whole class drawing." "Maybe," Mrs. Patterson said calmly. "Or maybe he needs someone to show him that his interests matter too." "You're too soft," Mrs. Chen muttered. "That's why these kids never learn." Mrs. Patterson didn't argue. She'd been teaching long enough to know that some conversations weren't worth having. People had their opinions about how to handle difficult students, and most of those opinions involved punishment, stricter rules, tougher love. She'd tried all that early in her career. It rarely worked. That afternoon, during classwork time, she watched Daniel from her desk. He'd actually pulled out the worksheet she'd given the class. For 10 minutes, he just stared at it. She could see him reading the questions, his pencil hovering over the paper but not touching it. Then finally, he started writing. His handwriting was messy, almost illegible. His answers were short, basic, but they were there. He was trying. Mrs. Patterson set a timer on her phone for 30 minutes. When it went off, she walked to his desk. "Time for your 15 minutes, she said quietly. Daniel looked up at her like he couldn't quite believe it was real. Then he pushed the worksheet aside, pulled out the new drawing pad, and his whole body changed. The tension melted out of his shoulders. His breathing slowed. He selected a pencil and started drawing, and it was like watching someone finally exhale after holding their breath for too long. The transformation was immediate. This fidgety, uncomfortable kid who could barely sit still suddenly had perfect focus. His hand moved across the page with confidence. Other students noticed too. A few craned their necks to see what he was working on. When the bell rang, Daniel carefully put his supplies away. As he passed her desk on the way out, he paused. "I finished the worksheet," he said. "I know. You did good work today, Daniel." Something that might have been a smile crossed his face, gone so quickly she almost missed it. But not everyone was happy with the arrangement. 2 weeks later, Principal Henderson called her to his office. She knew what it was about before she even sat down. "I've been hearing concerns," he began, leaning back in his chair, "about special treatment for the Romano kid." "He's not getting special treatment," Mrs. Patterson said. "He's getting appropriate support. There's a difference. Some teachers feel you're being too lenient, that you're letting him off easy while other students have to follow the rules. He is following the rules. He's completing his work. He's participating. For the first time since he got here, he's actually engaged." Henderson sighed. Look, Patricia, I know you mean well, but this kid has a history. A bad one. I don't want you getting your hopes up just to have him crash and burn like he did at his last 2 schools. What if he doesn't? She countered. What if all he needed was someone to see past the history? And what if giving him special privileges just sets him up for disappointment when the next teacher won't do the same? That question hung in the air between them. Mrs. Patterson thought about it carefully before responding. Then at least for this year, for these few months, he'll know that someone believed in him, that someone thought he was worth the effort. Maybe that's enough to make a difference. Henderson rubbed his temples. Just be careful, okay? I don't want to see you get hurt when this doesn't work out the way you hope. Walking back to her classroom, Mrs. Patterson felt the weight of doubt trying to settle on her shoulders. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe she was being naive. Maybe Daniel would revert to his old patterns and she'd end up disappointed. But then she reached her classroom and saw him already there, even though the bell hadn't rung yet. He was sitting at his desk, working on a math assignment from another class, rushing to finish it. When he saw her, he quickly explained, "If I get this done, I'll have time to draw in your class today." And just like that, the doubt lifted. Over the next few weeks, something remarkable happened. Daniel started completing work in other classes too. Not because the teachers offered him drawing time, but because he'd internalized a new understanding. Effort leads to reward. Work leads to opportunity. It was a simple equation, but it was one nobody had shown him before. His English assignments improved. His handwriting got neater. He started asking questions when he didn't understand something instead of just sitting there in silence. He was still quiet, still wore that hoodie most days, still sat in the back, but he was present now in a way he hadn't been before. And his drawing time? That became sacred. Those 15 minutes at the end of each class were when Daniel truly came alive. Other students began looking forward to it too, gathering around his desk to watch him work. He didn't mind the audience. If anything, he seemed to appreciate it. One day a girl named Ashley asked him, "How do you know where to put the shadows?" Daniel looked up, surprised to be asked a direct question. You have to think about where the light is coming from. Then everything else falls into place. Could you show me sometime? He glanced at Mrs. Patterson, who gave him an encouraging nod. Yeah, I guess I could do that. It was a small moment, a simple exchange. But Mrs. Patterson saw it for what it was. Daniel connecting with another student. Daniel sharing his knowledge. Daniel being seen not as a problem, but as someone with something valuable to offer. That afternoon after school, she found a note on her desk. The handwriting was messy but readable. Thank you for the art stuff. And for letting me draw. Nobody ever let me before. They always said I needed to focus on real work. But this feels like real work to me. Like maybe the most real thing I do. It wasn't signed. But it didn't need to be. Mrs. Patterson folded the note carefully and tucked it into her desk drawer, right next to a photocopy of one of Daniel's earliest drawings. She kept them there as a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of faith yield the biggest returns, and this was only the beginning. 5 months had passed since Daniel first walked into Mrs. Patterson's classroom. 5 months of small victories, gradual progress, and careful trust building. He was completing his work now, not just in English but in most of his classes. The hood still went up sometimes, especially on tough days, but more often now it stayed down. Mrs. Patterson had been watching the calendar. The city's young artist competition deadline was approaching. Every year, students from across the district submitted their work for a chance to win scholarships and recognition. She'd never entered a student before, mostly because she'd never had one talented enough to compete at that level, until now. The idea had been growing in her mind for weeks. But she knew she had to be careful. Daniel's confidence was still fragile, built on a foundation that was only just beginning to solidify. If she asked him to enter and he refused, or worse, if he entered and didn't win, it could undo all the progress they'd made. So she made a decision that some might call controversial. She decided not to tell him. Over the next week, during Daniel's drawing time, Mrs. Patterson casually photographed his work. She pretended to be checking her phone, taking attendance, organizing papers, but really she was capturing images of his drawings. The cityscape with impossible architecture. The portrait of hands reaching toward light. The tree with branches like veins. The broken chain suspended in midair. Each photograph felt like a small betrayal, a secret kept, but she told herself it was for a good reason. The application required 3 pieces of artwork and a brief essay about the artist. Mrs. Patterson spent an entire evening at her kitchen table, choosing the best photographs, adjusting the lighting on her computer to make them clear. Then came the hard part, writing about Daniel. She couldn't include his history. The foster homes, the expulsions, the incident reports. That wasn't the story his art told. Instead, she wrote about a young artist who used drawing to make sense of the world, who created beauty in the margins, who saw things differently than everyone else. She wrote about raw talent and untapped potential. She wrote about what she saw when she looked at his work. A young person with something important to say. She hit submit at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, then closed her laptop and hoped she'd made the right choice. The waiting was harder than she expected. 6 weeks, the website said, before winners would be announced. 6 weeks of watching Daniel grow more confident, of seeing him help other students with their drawings, of witnessing him slowly become part of the classroom community, rather than hovering at its edges. 6 weeks of wondering if she should tell him what she'd done. She almost did, several times. The words would be right there, ready to come out. "Daniel, I entered you in a competition." But something always stopped her. What if he got angry that she'd submitted his work without permission? What if the anticipation was too much pressure? What if he didn't win and felt like he'd let her down? So she kept quiet and waited. The email arrived on a Wednesday morning before school started. Mrs. Patterson was at her desk, reviewing the day's lesson plan, when her computer chimed with a new message. The subject line made her heart skip. Young Artist Competition Results. Her hands actually shook as she opened it. Dear Mrs. Patricia Patterson, we are pleased to inform you that your student Daniel Romano has been selected as the first-place winner in the middle school category. His work demonstrated exceptional technical skill, emotional depth, and artistic vision beyond his years. Daniel has been awarded a full scholarship to the Metropolitan Art Institute's prestigious summer intensive program, along with a $1,000 prize. Mrs. Patterson read it 3 times. Then she put her head down on her desk and tried not to cry. The award ceremony was scheduled for 2 weeks away. She had to tell him, but how? That afternoon, after the final bell, she asked Daniel to stay behind. He looked worried immediately, that old familiar tension creeping back into his shoulders. Am I in trouble? No, Daniel. The opposite, actually. I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear the whole thing before you react, okay? He nodded slowly, sinking into the chair beside her desk. Mrs. Patterson took a breath. A few months ago, I entered some of your drawings into the city's Young Artist competition. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to add pressure or make you anxious. I just thought your work deserved to be seen by people who understand art. Daniel's face went through several emotions at once. Confusion, surprise, something that might have been betrayal. You submitted my drawings. Without asking, I did. And before you get angry, I need you to read this. She pulled up the email and turned her computer screen toward him. He read it slowly, his lips moving slightly as he worked through the words. She watched his expression change from upset to disbelief, to something she couldn't quite identify. First place. His voice cracked. This is real? It's real, Daniel. You won. The judges said your work showed exceptional skill and emotional depth. They want you to attend their summer program. All expenses paid. He stared at the screen, not moving, barely breathing. Then he looked at her with eyes that were suddenly bright with tears he was trying hard not to shed. I've never won anything before. The simple statement broke her heart a little. Well, you just won something big. The ceremony is in 2 weeks at the City Art Museum. You'll receive your award there and they'll display your winning piece on the big screen for everyone to see. The art museum? Daniel looked panicked now. I've never been there. I don't know how to act at those places. I don't have anything nice to wear. Mrs. Patterson smiled. We'll figure all that out. I'll be there with you. And I already called your foster parents. They're planning to come too. Mrs. Patterson? Daniel's voice was small. What if I'm not actually good? What if this was a mistake? She recognized that fear. She'd seen it in students before. That moment when opportunity appears and they can't quite believe they deserve it. Daniel, look at me. This wasn't a mistake. Your art is real. Your talent is real. You earned this. Nobody gave it to you out of pity. You won because you're genuinely talented. Do you understand? He nodded, but she could see him struggling to accept it. The next 2 weeks were a blur of preparation. Mrs. Patterson took Daniel shopping for dress clothes, arguing with him when he insisted the cheapest option was fine. She helped him write a short speech for the ceremony, even though he was convinced he wouldn't be able to get the words out. She watched him practice in front of the bathroom mirror during lunch, heard him stumble over the same lines again and again. Other students got wind of what was happening. The news spread through school. Daniel, the quiet kid who sat in the back and drew during class, had won a major art competition. Suddenly, people looked at him differently. Teachers who'd written him off started asking about his work. Students who'd never spoken to him before wanted to see his drawings. Ashley, the girl who'd asked about shadows months ago, organized a group of students to make a banner. "Congratulations, Daniel," it read, decorated with drawings that tried to imitate his style. They hung it in Mrs. Patterson's classroom, and when Daniel saw it, he stood there for a long moment just staring. "You okay?" Mrs. Patterson asked quietly. "Yeah," he said. "It's just weird. People caring, I mean. I'm not used to it." The night before the ceremony, Mrs. Patterson couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about that first day, about Daniel shuffling into her classroom with his head down and his shoulders hunched, about the file full of incident reports, about everyone who'd said not to waste her energy. She thought about the moment she'd seen those drawings in the margins of his notebook, about the decision to offer him those 15 minutes of drawing time. Small moments, simple choices, but they'd led here, to this kid getting a chance he never thought he'd have. Sometimes, she realized, changing someone's life doesn't require grand gestures or massive interventions. Sometimes it just requires paying attention, seeing what others miss, believing when everyone else has given up. The next morning, she put on her best dress and drove to the City Art Museum, her heart full of hope and anticipation. Daniel's life was about to change. She could feel it. And she was grateful, so deeply grateful, that she'd get to be there to see it happen. The City Art Museum stood like a fortress of glass and marble on 5th Street. Daniel had passed it countless times on the bus, always wondering what kind of people went inside places like that. Important people, he'd assumed. People who belonged. Not kids like him. Now here he was, standing at the entrance in a button-up shirt that still had creases from the package, dress pants that felt too stiff, and shoes that actually fit. Mrs. Patterson stood beside him, and he could feel his foster parents, the Hendersons, hovering uncertainly behind them. "You ready?" Mrs. Patterson asked. Daniel's stomach was doing flips. "What if I mess up the speech?" "Then you mess it up. Nobody's perfect. They're here to celebrate your art, not judge your public speaking." Through the glass doors, he could see people gathering. Lots of people. Students in nice clothes, parents with cameras, teachers, judges, reporters even. The banner hanging from the ceiling read, "Young Artists Competition Celebration." "I can't do this," Daniel whispered. Mrs. Patterson put a hand on his shoulder. "Yes, you can. I've watched you do hard things for months now. This is just one more hard thing, and I'll be right there with you." They walked inside, and Daniel felt like he'd entered a different world. The ceilings were impossibly high. Real paintings hung on the walls, the kind he'd only seen in books. Everything smelled like money and importance. He tried to make himself smaller, that old instinct kicking in. A woman with a clipboard approached them, smiling. "Daniel Romano, we're so glad you're here. Let me show you where you'll be sitting." She led them to the front row of a section of chairs facing a small stage. Other students were already seated, all looking nervous in their own ways. Daniel recognized a few faces from other schools. These were the winners in different categories, the other kids who'd somehow earned their way into this space. "The ceremony starts in 15 minutes, the woman explained. "When they call your name, just walk up to the stage. Principal Madsen will hand you the award. Say a few words if you'd like, then return to your seat. Simple as that." Simple. Right. Mrs. Patterson squeezed his hand once before taking her seat in the audience section. The Hendersons sat beside her, looking as uncomfortable as Daniel felt. They were nice people, his current foster parents, but he'd only been with them for 8 months. They weren't really family. Not yet, maybe not ever. Foster arrangements rarely lasted. The ceremony began with speeches from various officials. The museum director talked about the importance of supporting young artists. The competition coordinator discussed how many entries they'd received this year. A local news anchor serving as the host made jokes that got polite laughter. Daniel barely heard any of it. His heart was pounding so hard he thought everyone must be able to hear it. His palms were sweating. The speech he'd practiced 100 times had completely vanished from his mind. Then they started announcing winners. Elementary category first. A small girl with pigtails accepted her award for a painting of her family. Middle school honorable mentions next. Each student walked up, received their certificate, said thank you, sat back down. And now, the news anchor said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, our first place winner in the middle school category. This young artist's work stood out to our judges not just for its technical excellence, but for its emotional power and unique vision. Please welcome Daniel Romano. This was it. Daniel stood on legs that felt like they might give out. The walk to the stage felt like it took forever and no time at all. The lights were bright. The audience was watching. His hands were shaking as Principal Madsen handed him the award, a glass sculpture that caught the light and threw rainbows across his shirt. Congratulations, Daniel. Would you like to say a few words? The microphone was in front of him. All those people were looking at him. He opened his mouth and nothing came out. Then on the screen behind him, his winning piece appeared. The drawing of hands reaching through bars toward a bird in flight. Seeing it blown up that large, displayed for everyone, something shifted inside him. His voice cracked and he cleared his throat. I never thought I was good at anything. People told me I was a problem, that I'd never amount to much. But then Mrs. Patterson, my teacher, she saw something different. She saw my drawings and she told me they mattered. She gave me time to draw and supplies to use and believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. He found her in the audience. She was crying, not even trying to hide it. This award, it's not just mine. It belongs to her too. Because she's the one who taught me that maybe I'm not just a problem kid. Maybe I'm an artist. Thank you. The applause was loud and long. Daniel walked back to his seat, clutching the award, feeling like he was floating. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur. More awards, more speeches, refreshments afterward where people kept coming up to him, asking about his work, telling him he had a bright future. A reporter interviewed him for the local news. What are you most excited about? She asked. The summer program, Daniel said. I've never been to anything like that before. A whole month just focusing on art, learning from real artists. It feels like a dream. What do you want to be when you grow up? Nobody had ever asked him that question before. Not seriously. He thought about it carefully. I want to be someone who makes things. Beautiful things. Things that make people feel something when they look at them. The reporter smiled. I think you're already doing that. That summer program changed everything. Mrs. Patterson drove Daniel to the Metropolitan Art Institute on the first day, helped him carry his supplies to the dormitory, met his instructors. For 4 weeks he was surrounded by other young artists, people who understood what it meant to see the world through a different lens. He learned new techniques, oil painting, watercolors, digital art. He studied art history and discovered artists who'd struggled with similar challenges. He found out he wasn't alone, that lots of creative people had difficult childhoods, that pain could be transformed into something meaningful. When he returned home, he wasn't the same kid who'd left. He stood straighter, spoke more. The hoodie stayed in his closet most days. He'd made friends at the program, real friends, and they kept in touch through email and video calls. 8th grade was different too. Word had spread about the competition and the summer program. Other teachers actually asked to see his work. The art teacher recruited him to help with an after-school program for younger students interested in drawing. Daniel found he liked teaching, liked showing others the techniques he'd learned. You're good at this, Mrs. Patterson told him one day, watching him explain perspective to a 6th grader. Patient, clear. You remember what it's like to be confused and struggling. I remember someone being patient with me, Daniel replied. High school brought new opportunities. An arts magnet school across town had heard about him and offered a spot in their advanced program. It meant a longer commute, leaving the Hendersons' house early each morning, but Daniel didn't mind. For the first time in his life, he was excited about school. He stayed in touch with Mrs. Patterson. Monthly coffee meetings where he'd show her his latest work, and she'd tell him about her current students. She never took credit for what he'd accomplished, always insisted he'd done it himself. But Daniel knew better. College applications in senior year, full scholarship offers from art schools across the country. He chose the Rhode Island School of Design. partly because of their reputation, partly because it was far enough away to feel like a fresh start, but close enough to visit Mrs. Patterson during breaks. The night before he left for college, he stopped by her house with a gift. A drawing he'd worked on for weeks, framed and matted professionally. It showed a teacher and a student sitting at a desk, a notebook between them. In the margins of the notebook, tiny detailed drawings of a city, a tree, a bird in flight. Mrs. Patterson cried when she opened it. "Daniel, this is beautiful." "It's called The Beginning," he said. "Because that's what it was. In your classroom. The beginning of everything." 10 years later, Daniel stood in front of Lincoln Middle School again. He was 27 now. A professional illustrator whose work appeared in magazines, books, children's stories. He'd been published, exhibited, recognized, but none of that compared to what he was about to do. Mrs. Patterson, retired now but still sharp as ever, sat in the front row of the auditorium as Daniel addressed the entire school. Students filled the seats, curious about this guest speaker their teachers were so excited about. "I sat where you're sitting," Daniel began, his voice steady now, confident. "Right here in this school. And I want to tell you something important. When I first came here, I had a file that said I was a problem. People looked at that file and decided who I was before they even met me, but one teacher didn't do that." He gestured to Mrs. Patterson, and the audience turned to look at her. She waved, embarrassed by the attention. Mrs. Patterson looked past the file, past the reputation, past all the reasons people had written me off. She saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. And because she saw it, because she believed in it, I eventually saw it too. He clicked to the next slide in his presentation, showing some of his professional work alongside those early notebook drawings. "Here's what I learned. Labels aren't destiny. Other people's opinions aren't facts. And sometimes all it takes is one person who refuses to give up on you to change the entire direction of your life." He paused, looking out at all those young faces. "So if you're sitting there thinking you're not good enough, not smart enough, not talented enough, I want you to know that you're wrong. You just haven't found your thing yet. Or maybe you have found it, but nobody's noticed. Either way, don't give up on yourself. Because somewhere there might be a teacher like Mrs. Patterson waiting to see who you really are. And when that happens, everything changes." After the assembly, students lined up to ask questions, look at his portfolio, talk about art. Daniel answered each one patiently, remembering what it felt like to be 12 and lost and looking for something to hold on to. When the last student left, Mrs. Patterson approached. She was 70 now, officially retired, but still attending school events, still caring about kids. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. "I know," Daniel replied. "You always were. Even when I didn't deserve it. Especially then." They stood there in the empty auditorium, teacher and former student, connected by a choice made a decade ago. A choice to see potential instead of problems, to offer opportunity instead of judgment, to believe that even the most difficult kids carry gifts worth nurturing. "You changed my life," Daniel said. "You know that, right?" Mrs. Patterson smiled. "No, Daniel. I just gave you space to change your own life. You did the hard part. We did it together." And that, Mrs. Patterson thought, was exactly right. Change rarely happens in isolation. It happens in the space between people, in moments of connection, in the small acts of faith we extend to each other. It happens when someone sees past the surface to the person underneath. When they decide that every kid deserves a chance, even the ones everyone else has given up on. Daniel went on to mentor young artists, to teach workshops, to be for other kids what Mrs. Patterson had been for him. The cycle continued, spreading outward, touching more lives than either of them could count. And it all started with a teacher who looked at a file full of problems and decided to look for possibilities instead. Who saw drawings in the margins and recognized them for what they were. Not distractions from the real work, but maybe the most real work of all.